Part 1. The weight of Sector Delta 9. The air over Sector Delta 9, bordering the triple canopy expanse where Laos bled into Cambodia, wasn't just humid. It was suffocating with anticipated history. Sergeant Rourke, his face a roadmap of previous incursions, felt the familiar pressure of operating where the rules of engagement were written in blood and erased by political expediency. His 5-man LRRP team, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, had been inserted 3 clicks deep into denied territory, their mission strictly observational, confirming the presence and frequency of high-value NVA logistics moving south along the arterial veins of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Their primary asset wasn't their M16S or Claymores, but a sophisticated, newly deployed acoustic surveillance array designed to map subterranean and vehicular movement undetectable by conventional listening posts. The insertion had been textbook, quiet, swift, ghost-like. Now began the true war, the war against time, biology, and sanity. They settled into a carefully prepared hide called the Eye, a knot of ancient roots and dense ferns overlooking a suspected choke point. The initial hours were spent fighting the urge to move, to speak, to even breathe too deeply. Rourke watched Specialist Tran, the team's designated Kit Kat Vietnamese-American, adjusting the hydrophones buried meters away. Tran carried the double burden of being ethnically invisible to the enemy while feeling alien among his own unit. His silence was deeper than Rourke's. It was the silence of a man listening for the ghost of a world he rejected. The duality of their existence was immediately apparent. They were the epitome of mobility and swift violence, yet their current objective demanded absolute, rigid stillness. Every mosquito bite was a screaming emergency. Every muscle twitch a potential betrayal. The weight of the impending combat was heavier during this waiting phase than any firefight Rourke had ever endured, because here, the slightest error meant not just death, but failure that could cost dozens of lives back in the main camps. He calculated the duration of the deployment, 4 days minimum. 4 days of existing as cold-blooded reptiles in the oppressive humidity, waiting for the one moment when their presence would transition from passive observation to violent terminal contact. The jungle wall surrounding them was thick, green, and completely silent, save for the rhythmic, almost mechanical dripping of condensation. A silence Rourke knew was the deadliest illusion of Vietnam. Part 2. The evisceration of sound. The silence of Sector Delta 9 was not the absence of sound. It was the evisceration of natural noise, leaving behind a vacuum that amplified every internal, unwanted sound. The grinding of teeth, the frantic pulse in the ears, the subtle friction of synthetic fatigues against damp skin. This was the psychological battlefield Rourke had warned his team about. The jungle was supposed to be alive. Howler monkeys, cicadas, a symphony of insects. But here, along the heavy transit corridors, the jungle had been systematically poisoned by human passage. The NVA were masters of masking sound, but their continual movement, the construction of bypasses, and the sheer volume of material moving through had driven the wildlife away. Private Ghost Miller, the team's young designated marksman, was struggling the most. Miller prided himself on his ability to achieve perfect stillness, a meditative state where he could hold a breath for over a minute. He had chosen a position 20 yards out from the main hide, an almost impossible spot under a fallen, decaying ironwood tree, demanding total non-movement. Rourke monitored him through the scope. Miller was a statue, dripping sweat, his eyes focused on the single square yard of mud where he'd placed his boots. But that stillness was corrosive. Doc Chavez, huddled next to Rourke, watched Miller's respiratory rate dip dangerously low. "He's trying to disappear, Sarge. But this jungle doesn't let you disappear," Chavez whispered, his voice catching the thick air. Tran, working constantly with the sensor readings, was the only one who seemed marginally unaffected, perhaps because the equipment provided a mechanical, measurable distraction from the psychological void. Tran reported the readings, faint, deep thrumming, hours apart, confirming heavy trucks far below the surface of the trail complex. They were close. The problem wasn't hearing the enemy. The problem was the enemy, not hearing them. Rourke knew that the NVA sappers and point men, having trained for decades in these environments, would eventually realize the silence was artificial. Unnatural forest hums. This one had a deadly, echoing stillness, and that was a threat signature in itself. Rourke worried Miller's dedication to silence was blinding him to the fact that absolute stillness in this environment was, paradoxically, screaming. We are here, Part 3. The Whispering Convoy and the Moral Weight. On the 48th hour, the hydrophone screamed, not with sound, but with data. Tran urgently signaled Rourke, pointing to the scope display, a dense cluster of acoustic signatures, moving slowly, deliberately, less than a kilometer away. It wasn't just logistics. The signature analysis suggested a high concentration of metallic shielding, possibly carrying SAM components or specialized communication gear, a priority target. Rourke felt the familiar cold spike of adrenaline. The waiting was ending. The contact was imminent, but still observational. Their orders were clear: confirm target value, relay coordinates, and, if necessary, vector and air support. Only if extraction was possible immediately afterwards. Engaging with their meager resources against a convoy of this size was suicide. Through his binoculars, Rourke began to make out the first silhouettes through the dense cover. A patrol element, disciplined, silent, moving with the preternatural fluidity of soldiers who lived underground. They were followed by 3 heavy transport trucks, tarped and low-riding, their engines muffled by years of guerrilla ingenuity. The weight of the moment was crushing. Rourke could take out the point element now, cause chaos, and guarantee the mission fails. Or he could wait, endure the agonizing proximity, and guarantee the data transmission. The waiting required a higher form of discipline than the fighting. He had to suppress every aggressive instinct honed over 6 tours. Miller, 20 yards away, was perfectly positioned for a shot on the lead NVA officer, a shot that would be devastatingly effective and terminally compromising. Rourke held his breath, willing Miller to stay put. The officer paused, lifting his hand, a sign of caution. He looked directly toward their hide, not seeing them, but sensing the unnatural quality of the air. Rourke realized the moral dilemma was physical. The mission required them to accept the presence of the enemy without acting to allow them to pass, knowing these arms would soon be used to kill American soldiers. This forced, deliberate inaction felt dirtier, more cowardly than any retreat. The convoy was now within 300 yards, its slow, heavy presence vibrating in the very earth beneath them. The clock was ticking down to 0, not to engagement, but to the moment of relief when they would be gone. Part 4. The pressure cooker of non-action. 72 hours had passed, marked only by the slow, painful rotation of Rourke's watch hand. The convoy had passed, the data secured and transmitted in brief, encrypted bursts when they were certain the sector was quiet again. But the success of the observation only intensified the pressure of the waiting. They now had to sit and wait for the recovery team, knowing the enemy was aware that something had happened, the sudden, inexplicable presence of a quiet spot in their established transit route. Rourke enforced mandatory rest cycles, 2 hours on, 4 hours off, forcing the men to stay hydrated and eat the tasteless compressed rations. But sleep was impossible. The mind, relieved of the immediate threat, began cannibalizing itself. Rourke focused on the memory of Fire Base Delta in '68, where he'd lost half a platoon because he'd jumped the gun, engaging a scout party too soon, alerting the main force which enveloped them. That lesson was burned into his subconscious. Patience saves lives, but patience here was torturous. Miller, after the passing of the convoy, seemed physically ill. The effort of holding that absolute, unnatural stillness while the NVA marched within spitting distance had broken something in his reserve. He was shivering violently, gripping his rifle like a lifeline, muttering about the smell of the damp earth and how it smelled like rotted time. Tran found a way to externalize his stress, meticulously cleaning and re-cleaning the sensor wiring, every coil precise, every connection sealed against moisture. Chavez was running low on nerve pills, rationing them strictly, knowing that Rourke would be the last man to admit he needed one. The humidity had turned the air into soup. The constant dampness had begun to breed trench foot despite their best efforts. Every man was chafed, covered in infected insect bites, and living on the razor's edge of physical collapse. They were waiting for a helicopter that might never come, in a location that was becoming colder by the minute, not in temperature, but in psychological isolation. The jungle wall was no longer protective. It was a green, silent cage, and they were the prey. Part 5. The glitch and the rising paranoia. The turning point arrived with a whisper of static. Around noon on the third full day, Tran, checking the long-range monitoring system, frowned. The audio channel from the main hydrophone, the one that provided the distant rumble of the trail, had gone silent. Not the natural silence of no movement, but a dead, electronic silence. Rourke immediately pressed him. "Line cut, Tran." Tran shook his head, running diagnostics on the receiver box. "No, Sarge. Signal is good, battery is good. But the hydrophone itself is reporting zero resonance. It's like the microphone itself just failed. It's impossible. We sealed that thing against everything." The failure introduced a terrifying variable. Was it equipment failure, or was the NVA now actively sweeping and neutralizing their surveillance points? They had relied entirely on that acoustic buffer zone. Now, they were deaf to anything beyond the immediate, terrifyingly quiet perimeter. Paranoia spiked instantly. Rourke knew they couldn't risk sending a man out to check the hydrophone. That was exactly the kind of move the NVA would anticipate and exploit. They were blind. The pressure of the silence intensified, becoming hostile. Chavez reported Miller was fully withdrawn, non-communicative, his eyes fixed on the tree line with maniacal intensity. "He's seeing ghosts, Rourke. He thinks they already know we're here." Rourke moved to Miller's position, crawling the painful, agonizing distance through the undergrowth, feeling the ground for unnatural pressure points. He reached Miller and whispered, harsh and low, "Ghost, snap out of it. What do you see?" Miller didn't answer for long moments. Then, his voice a dried rasp, he replied, "The birds, Sarge. They stopped. Hours ago. The jungle's holding its breath." Rourke listened. Miller was right. Not a single insect chirped. Not a single leaf rustled naturally. The wind, which had been a steady source of masking noise, had died completely. The silence was now absolute, a thick blanket woven by hostile intelligence. Rourke realized with icy certainty. The failure of the hydrophone wasn't their only problem. The complete, unnatural stillness around them had been weaponized. Part 6. The fatal flaw of perfect stillness. The NVA, highly sensitive to the subtlest shifts in their environment, didn't need a hydrophone to know something was wrong. Their scouts, veterans of countless border skirmishes, were reading the jungle itself. They noted the missing bird calls, the absence of the typical rustling of rodents, and most crucially, the localized dead air. A small, 4-acre patch of profound, unnatural quiet amidst the general humid symphony of the surrounding forest. This quiet signaled an apex predator maintaining perfect ambush discipline. It was the only signal they needed. Rourke realized their mistake. In striving for the perfect stealth, they had alienated themselves from the natural ecosystem, turning their camouflage into a marker. The NVA probe, led by a small, deadly unit known locally as the Shadow Cats, approached their hide slowly, meticulously, moving laterally outside the zone of stillness, listening for the boundary where the humming jungle resumed. Miller's position, 20 yards out, designed for the quiet kill, was now the most exposed. The Shadow Cats didn't rush. They understood that the Americans relied on noise, either making it or hearing it. They preferred the silence, using the very absence of sound to pinpoint the LRRP team's location. Rourke, now aware of the trap, strained his ears, desperate for any sound of movement, a broken twig, a shift in weight. But the Shadow Cats were too good. They were moving lower than the sound barrier, becoming part of the root structure. Suddenly, Rourke saw it. A tiny flicker of movement, a length of black paracord stretched taut, almost invisible against the loam, signaling movement to the flanking element. He reached for the radio, to break the silence himself, to create necessary confusion, but it was too late. He saw the muzzle flashes, low and precise, directed not at the main hide, but at Miller's position, the point of maximum stillness. The irony was devastating. Miller's dedication to perfect, absolute silence had been the precise factor that defined the target zone. The only time silence truly killed was when it was the only sound left. Part 7. Contact. The jungle wall exploded. The world fractured into a chaos of noise. The sound of Miller's M16 firing on full automatic was immediately cut short, replaced by the dry, distinct sound of AK-47 fire tearing through the vegetation where he lay. Rourke screamed, "Contact! 12 o'clock, low!" and simultaneously hurled the first fragmentation grenade. The detonation was deafening, momentarily replacing the jungle's deadly quiet with righteous fury. The main hide dissolved into a maelstrom of aimed fire. The shadow cats, highly trained, didn't scatter. They pressed the attack, capitalizing on their initial advantage. Their goal wasn't just to kill, but to neutralize the command element and capture the sophisticated acoustic gear. Tracer rounds sliced through the air like searing red wasps. Chavez was returning fire, his medic bag momentarily abandoned, his face grim as he laid down bursts toward the source of the enemy fire. Rourke knew their immediate priority had shifted from observation to pure survival. They were surrounded, and the enemy was inside their perimeter. The air was thick with gunpowder, splintered wood, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Rourke saw Miller's body twitching faintly near the ironwood, a lost cause. He forced his eyes away. Tran, cover fire, 3-second bursts. Chavez, prep smoke were moving. The sudden, overwhelming violence was a bizarre relief after the hours of crushing stillness. Action was simpler than waiting. Rourke felt the familiar cold clarity of combat return, focusing solely on the geometry of lead and cover. He emptied a magazine into the wall of green, ensuring that for every 3 rounds fired, one struck high to splinter the canopy, creating falling debris and confusion. But the NVA were relentless, utilizing the complex root systems as subterranean cover. They were fighting ghosts in a world they thought they had mastered. The true panic set in when Rourke felt the vibration of the ground, not the impact of explosions, but the deliberate, heavy thud of incoming mortar rounds vectored imprecisely on their coordinates. The mission objective was already forgotten. Now it was just about drawing the next breath. Part 8. Evasion through the undergrowth. The first mortar round landed 20 yards to their left, showering them with hot shrapnel and dirt. The impact bought them milliseconds of cover. Rourke grabbed Chavez, screaming now, "Follow Tran." Tran, utilizing his tracker instincts honed by years in the Delta, hadn't wasted a second on fire. He had been identifying the one weakness in the Shadow Cat's tight formation, a muddy runoff channel partially concealed by a dense curtain of vines. He laid down 3 carefully placed smoke grenades, red, green, yellow, not for extraction, but for immediate blinding cover. The smoke, thick and acrid, mixed with the rising steam from the wet jungle floor. They plunged into the channel, crawling under the weight of their packs and weapons, the mud serving as a brief, viscous shield. The NVA followed immediately, their rounds tearing through the smoke cloud, aiming low where they expected the bodies to be. This was the moment of true combat duality. They were fighting backward, covering their retreat with precise, economical shots, while physically moving forward, driven by the instinct to escape the kill zone. Rourke paused, firing 3 rounds toward a suspected enemy position, buying Tran 5 more yards of crawl space. Chavez was struggling, pulling his heavy medical kit, constantly looking back toward Miller, a silent grief tearing at his concentration. "Doc, move, damn it. We can't save him." Rourke roared, the sound swallowed by the choking smoke. Tran found a small, almost invisible opening in the root tangle, a natural siphon where a small stream had undercut the earth. They tumbled into it, finding momentary respite from the immediate, overwhelming fire. They were deep within the jungle's guts, submerged in thick, icy water, the sound of the firefight muted, but still perilously close. Rourke could feel the vibration of boots above them. They had escaped the initial contact, but they were now hunted prey, forced to use the terrain not just for cover, but as a weapon itself. Part 9. The River of Blood and the Abandoned Mission. They followed the culvert for 300 yards, the water eventually emptying them onto the banks of a narrow, sluggish tributary of the Mekong, their planned secondary extraction point. Rourke knew this was their last chance to get out. He pulled out the emergency radio, transmitting a panicked, brief code: Zulu, Zulu, Broken Arrow, LZ Alpha compromised. The immediate reply was static and interference. The NVA had jammed the frequency, likely using the sensitive communications gear they had observed passing days earlier. They were cut off. The sound of movement on the riverbank opposite them confirmed their worst fears. The Shadow Cats had anticipated this retreat. They opened fire instantly, pinning the remaining 3 men behind the muddy bank. The river water around them churned red with the rich mud, but Rourke knew the blood mixed there wasn't just earth. Tran was screaming, not in pain, but in frustration, his M16 cycling uselessly, jammed with grit and mud. Rourke looked at the acoustic sensor gear, the bulky, indispensable equipment that had been the focus of their entire mission. It was too heavy, too complex to haul across the heavily exposed river under direct fire. It was the physical anchor holding them down. He made the instantaneous, brutal decision. Leave the gear, Tran the battery, detonate the pack in 10 minutes, kill switch. The mission objective, the irreplaceable data, the high-value equipment, was abandoned to guarantee their survival. Rourke laid down suppressive fire with his last few magazines, focusing on the muzzle flashes across the bank. Chavez, his face pale, grabbed the detonator from the acoustic pack, slamming the timer. They needed a diversion. Rourke spotted an old, submerged log jam 20 yards downstream. We dive. Follow the current. They plunged into the freezing, dark water, letting the sluggish river pull them away from the immediate kill zone, while the timer on the destroyed mission objective counted down, preparing to deliver one last, violent, explosive lie to the NVA. A final, deafening sound that meant the Americans were gone. Part 10, Epilogue. Echoes of the Stillness. Extraction finally happened 6 hours later, 3 clicks south, under the cover of a massive, distracting airstrike called in by a distant forward operating base responding to Rourke's broken transmission. The 3 surviving members of the LRRP team were pulled out bloody, exhausted, and psychologically shattered. Back at base, the debriefing was quick and brutal. The mission was a tactical failure. The loss of the acoustic array was a severe blow, but a biological success. 3 men survived where 5 had gone in. Rourke, sitting in the infirmary, the ringing in his ears constant, stared at the wall. The colonel praised their valor during the contact, the swiftness of their retreat. But Rourke couldn't stop thinking about the moment before the chaos, the suffocating, perfect silence. Tran, cleaning the remaining mud from his boots, confessed to Rourke, "We became too much a part of the environment, Sarge. We hid too well. The jungle knew we weren't supposed to be that quiet." The psychological toll of the 4 days of waiting far surpassed the trauma of the 20 minutes of contact. The explosions, the screaming, the rifle fire, that was noise that made sense in a war zone. What haunted Rourke was the memory of Ghost Miller, frozen in his perfect hide, killed by the absolute absence of sound. Miller had achieved the ultimate stealth, and it had killed him. Rourke realized the terrible duality. In this war, the sound of life, the rustling of a forced breath, the chirp of a displaced bird, the necessary friction of movement, was not a weakness, but the only truly effective camouflage. The only time silence kills is when it's absolute, an unnatural void in a world meant to roar. The echoes that followed Rourke were not the sounds of the battle, but the lasting, insidious emptiness of Sector Delta 9, the silence that proved they had waited perfectly for death.